Miami and Florida. I'm Mike Massaro. Thanks for watching ESPN Classic.
Classic.
Havlicek steals it. Havlicek stole the ball. Down goes Frazier. Down goes Frazier. Down goes Frazier.
United to Amici. Amici powers in.
A grab from the bullet. A grab from the bullet.
Chicago Bulls have won their 6th NBA championship.
Gibson swings. This is gonna be a home run. Unbelievable! I don't believe what I just saw.
In 1951, radio broadcaster Bill Stern reported the greatest athlete of the first half of the 20th century was sick and penniless. Stern told his listeners, if you don't have any money, send him a card. Let him know you still think about him. After another 5 decades, Jim Thorpe's life still plays like frontier fiction. He was born in a one-room cabin in Oklahoma Territory just 12 years after the Battle of Little Bighorn.
He has a kind of mythic quality. His life story was very dramatic. He kind of touches on all of the American themes about the frontier. He's kind of a half a modern sports figure and half a kind of Paul Bunyan American mythic figure.
There must be something in the Thorpe legend for people to still be talking about him 50 years after he's dead.
The way he played the game so embodied the warrior spirit that Americans cherish in their athletes, that it has carried Thorpe all these years and makes him, in many people's minds, as alive and vivid as he was back then.
Can you imagine the day that there was no road, there was no electricity, no newspaper, nothing?
The specific source of Thorpe's warrior spirit was a Native American tribe that had been pushed by the white man into what is present-day Oklahoma.
The Sac and Fox have been in this country here for untold thousands of years. The dance itself, the drum is the heartbeat of the tribe.
So as long as you're a tribe, and as long as you stick together, you're going to always be a tribe. But the minute you begin to differ, you're going to get weak. You're going to drop off one at a time.
In May of 1888, Jim and his twin brother Charlie were the progeny of Hiram and Charlotte Thorpe. Their father was half Irish and their mother 1/4 French. But it was her Native American blood with which she identified.
By Indian tradition, when a child is born, sometimes the first thing that the mother sees became his name. In this case, the sun rising in the morning, a bright sun coming down a pathway, bright path.
Grandpa's house was on the banks of the North Canadian River, and he bred horses. And Dad's job as a young boy was to run those horses down and bring the horses in.
Despite his love of horses, Jim walked through more shadow than light in his early years. At 8, he lost Charlie to pneumonia. 6 years later, his mother died of tuberculosis. Increasingly difficult for his alcoholic father to manage, Jim was sent to a succession of Indian schools in Oklahoma and Kansas.
It was extremely difficult after his twin Charlie died. He had a hard time with school. In fact, the school that he was going to at the Indian agency, that every time Hiram would take him to the school, he would run home.
Life was spent, completely in and out of institutions and sort of bouncing back between a very disorganized and unpleasant family life and harsh institutional life. It was much more like out of a Charles Dickens novel than out of contemporary America.
We're thrust into this new world, and it caused incredible
turmoil in multitudes of our young children. When the children first went to Indian schools, traditionally you had the long hair, and that was a state of manliness, and there were negotiations by the tribal leaders, don't cut our young men's hair. And by the time the buggies and the wagons drove off campus, they had the young Indian boys in the chair, and they were cutting their hair short.
The idea was that Jim Thorpe, although legally a Native American, was going to be absorbed into the mainstream. His father wanted him to be educated in the white man's ways.
When he went to the first Indian school, he ran away. When he went to the second Indian school, he went away. He didn't like being put into regiment. The fact that he was constantly in motion, I think, was reflective that he was comfortable in no place.
Jim Thorpe grew up in that era of freedom, that expression, to run, feel his feet pounded against the earth, the beat of his heart. He knew himself, and he didn't want to lose that.
His father finally called up Indian customs people that he knew and said, I can't manage my son, Jim Thorpe. You've got to do something with him.
In 1904, Thorpe was shipped east to Carlisle, a federally funded all-Indian school in Pennsylvania, where he was subjected to a harsh regimen aimed at obliterating the last vestiges of his Native American heritage.
People should go down and look at Carlisle. Those are holding cells. Those are, confinement, dungeon cells down there. That's where they put the kids. The American people, they love Indians in a sort of a stand-back way. It's like a wolf, They love the wolf, but they're afraid of him. They fear him, and they kill him.
You were torn between two worlds. Thorpe had Indian blood, non-Indian blood, and you're in conflict. Am I Indian? Am I not Indian? I tend to think Jim Thorpe turned to sport, where you accepted on equal terms, and you learned to walk in two worlds with one spirit.
If he wanted to do something athletically, he didn't need coaching, he needed just to kind of observe it. He would watch and he would stare and he would see how things happen, and then he could go out and do it himself.
He was walking with a couple of friends from the school over, and there were a couple of guys struggling in the high jump. And he watched it, and Thorpe handed a couple of books to his friend and went over and jumped over 5 feet 8 inches in the high jump, the same height these guys have been struggling at. He had never high jumped before, and he was in street clothes.
Thorpe was enlisted on the track team by legendary coach Pop Warner in 1907. 2 years later, the first layer of what would become a national mythology was created when he almost single-handedly beat the opposition.
There were 6 members of the Carlisle team went to Lafayette. Dad participated in actually 7 events, and of the 7 events, he won 6 gold and 1 bronze.
Frequently, during these track meets, Jim would compete in 8 of the events. At the conclusion of these events, on the average, he would have garnered 6 gold medals.
He wanted to play football, but Pop Warner didn't want him to play because he didn't want his star track man to get hurt. Finally, Pop just said, well, okay, we'll give you a tryout, threw the ball at him and says, okay, you're going to go through tackling practice, and this is the first team, and go. And he ran through the whole team. Pop got all over his team members and saying, I want you to hit him and put him down and make him stay down. And they gave him the ball again, and he ran through the team again. So Pop Warner made him a team member after that.
Thorpe gained All-America honors in 1911 when his athletic genius raised Carlisle to the top echelon of collegiate football.
Harvard laid claim to the national championship, but before they could do that, they had to play Carlisle, and the Carlisle Indians beat them. Jim, with a badly swollen ankle, ran for 173 yards and kicked 4 field goals, the last being 48 yards to win the game 18-15.
These guys would come charging in on Dad, and Dad would just drop the ball and kick anybody that was close to him. So he put some of these guys in the hospital, and he had such a bad reputation for that that nobody wanted to charge in on him.
With absolutely no preparation, no background, no training, no coaching, he came off a reservation and just ran everybody ragged.
In May of 1912, Thorpe entered the Olympic trials in New York City. His goal was to qualify in the pentathlon and decathlon, but when he won 3 of 5 pentathlon events, the U.S. committee had seen enough.
The Olympic official said, listen, this is silly. We don't even need you to demonstrate how good you are. And so they sent him home. They never even conducted the trial, so he might be the only person in U.S. Olympic history to be named to the U.S. decathlon team on the basis of his reputation.
The athletes at that time were drawn from the universities. Who could go to the universities then? Only the very rich, very elite. So it was unusual that to have somebody of this humble beginning participate in the Olympics to start with.
You might have been able at that point to hold sport up as the great democracy, where an athlete is judged and celebrated by his ability to perform the job. Shouldn't that be what all of America is?
ESPN Classics Run Like a Deer is presented by John Deere. Nothing runs like a deer.
Little boy asks his neighbors why they're always working on their yard. Neighbor looks up. Nothing more relaxing.
Find out if a free sample's right for you.
My doctor says it's right for me. That's why I stay with it. For more information, go to Viagra.com.
The Olympic movement was not universal. It really was a movement based in Western Europe, but really didn't reach out to the rest of the world by 1912. It really needed a bit of momentum.
On the boat going over to the 1912 Olympics, Mike Murphy, one of the coaches, finds Thorpe in a hammock and says, Jim, aren't you going to practice? And Jim, with his eyes closed, goes, I'm just picturing how far I'm going to jump.
Jim Thorpe not only trained physically on that ship, but I think he was one of the few athletes training mentally. Today, visualization, imagery.
When the 5'11", 180-pound Native American arrived in Stockholm, his exotic appearance and long, shambling strides intrigued the Swedes.
Coming into the stadium, very few people knew anything about Jim Thorpe. They noticed he was an Indian. So, of course, in the newspapers, he was sometimes called just the Indian.
He was, for the time, a big person. And he walked around the infield with his chest out. The Swedish fans began to call him a horse because he had kind of like a gait of a horse. And they would go every day to the stadium to see the horse. And damn if the horse didn't win every day.
Jim Thorpe, who had never competed in a decathlon in his life, starts off with the pentathlon and in one day wins. And the very next day, while the rest of the athletes were recovering, goes out and places fourth in the high jump.
Having won gold in the pentathlon, Thorpe tested his awesome versatility in the 10-event decathlon.
He dominated the first event in the decathlon, which was the 100 meters. His shot put was better than anybody else's in the field. So by the time you get to the fourth event, it's pretty much over. He won by 700 points, and that's kind of like winning 15-0 in a baseball game or 45-0 in a football game.
To give you an idea of how good he was in the decathlon, his total points were being achieved in 1924, 28, and 32. As many as 20 years later, they were only doing what Thorpe did.
His performance in Stockholm was one of the highlights of Olympic history. Afterwards, King Gustav said to him, "Sir, you are the greatest athlete in the world." To which he replied, "Thanks, King."
Well, being crowned the greatest athlete of the world by the King of Sweden, I think, is one of my great moments in my life.
The title World's Greatest Athlete goes along with the Olympic champion in the decathlon. And it is a legitimate, standardized test of a person's athletic ability throughout history. He was world class in probably 5 or 6 events. Barring none, the greatest decathlete to ever live.
2 days after the track portion ended, he actually played an Olympic baseball game. Baseball was kind of an exhibition event in 1912, and the Americans got their best athletes, and they put Jim Thorpe out there in right field.
Thorpe had won 2 gold medals and the admiration of the world. After a rousing European tour arranged by the American Athletic Union, he steamed home to an avalanche of praise.
When the boat docked in New York, they were given a ticker tape parade. And Thorpe was put in the back of an open automobile and driven down Broadway, and people simply called his name and shouted his name. Thorpe is purported to have said, geez, I never knew a guy could have so many friends.
He was lionized beyond anybody's wildest dreams. He came back believing that the accoutrements of that celebrity would accrue to him for his whole life. And unfortunately, he came back having represented a country that wasn't entirely willing to let him be a full citizen.